Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much again for being here. It is such an honor. Just some quick housekeeping things from me. You might hear noises from my neighborhood going on, so please just disregard as I'm just working through this presentation. And I've got 4 lovely fur children who love to interrupt the work that I do. So please be patient with me in case they try to jump onto the computer, because that is a strong possibility today. So, as you already know, we are going to be talking about white supremacy in counselor education and how do we move forward with racial justice in the counseling field. So we know that a lot of the discourse that's been going on right now really points to this idea that we are past racism, right? There is this idea out there that racism is no longer a thing and that, the experiences of people of color, with racism is a thing of the past, but that is not true. In fact, it's still perpetuated as what we've seen, right? With all of the racial violence, the systemic violence that has been going on, more people are paying attention more than ever, and we need people to continue paying attention. One area where we need to pay attention to racial and systemic violence is in counselor education, because we want counselor education to continuously be a space where counselors in training can, grow and feel supported, particularly our counselors of color, as they are working to support their communities. And as well as for white counselors and other socially dominant counselors who are working to support minoritized communities, it's so important that we point out how white supremacy might still be here and how do we move forward with this knowledge? What do we do with that? So let's take a look. So, one of the important things is we need to look at how it's still present in our teaching practices. And this is not to say that all of our universities do this. It's only to point out what is still happening in the field. So I just want to make sure that that point is clear for everybody. And so when it comes to teaching, right, we have to be mindful of what is happening in curriculum, right? Because what's happening in some of our curriculum is that sometimes communities of color are presented through a deficit-based perspective, which means they are ultimately presented as victims and they're not portrayed as survivors. Their stories of survival and empowerment and joy are not being told. And so we need to look at our curriculums and really think, what types of stories are we putting out there for our students when we are teaching them about multiculturalism, when we are teaching them about racial struggle or any type of minoritized struggle? What type of perspectives are we putting out there, right? And we also have to acknowledge the theories that are still mainly Eurocentric, especially in counseling. A lot of our foundational counseling theories have been created by white folks, right? And especially white men in particular. And with that, there is this problem of, how much time do we spend teaching about counseling theories that are rooted from minoritized experiences, that are rooted in, for example, like liberation. How often do we teach that? How often are we teaching queer theory, right? So the idea that we question and deconstruct what is often normalized by dominant social discourses. So we have to think about that. I'm sorry, what was that? Oh, okay, sorry. So we have to think about that in our curriculum. And we also really have to look at our classroom culture too. So we have to look beyond the content and we have to look at how do we foster our classroom culture? Who are the students that are mainly speaking in class? Who do we choose to hear from? And who are we not hearing from enough, right? We need to rely on, teaching andragogies that are rooted in, like abolitionist teaching by the works of Dr. Bettina Love. We need to be looking at social justice oriented teaching practices that speak to and honor minoritized voices in the classroom. So that way they're feeling heard too, and they can help co-educate their classmates without feeling burdened to do so, because we see that happening too in counselor education. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Lastly, one of the things that we definitely see in counselor education is what we call paralysis of analysis, which basically means there's a lack of teaching that focuses on actual social justice action. So in a lot of curriculums right now, or curricula, we're really looking at okay, this is what social justice is. This is what multiculturalism is. But we are not looking at what do we do about it. We're not looking at the action steps, what students and counselors in training could be doing to practice social justice with their clients. And we need to have those talks. We can't be paralyzed by fear, because more than ever, our minoritized communities need us. And so we need to be teaching our students, having conversations with our students about how do we engage in social justice action. And so we also need to really take a look at how white supremacy impacts student welfare. So let's take a look at that for just a moment. So we have to acknowledge that while not all counseling programs do this, there are still some program climates out there that pressure students of color to educate their white peers, right? Which is a problem in a lot of ways, because we have to acknowledge that on the one hand, yes, we know that, you know, white folks in our field are still learning so much about racial issues, racial histories, right? They're still learning about that. Yet, when we pressure our students of color to educate us, we often put them through unseen and unrecognized emotional labor and having them tell their stories to us over and over and over again, which can lead to re-traumatizing and burning out our students of color. And so we need to really think about how do we protect our students of color and seek them out as colleagues, and not as the ultimate teacher that they need to teach me things. How do we empower ourselves to learn? We also have to take a look at faculty and student relationships that are utilized to maintain tokenism, to put out this idea of post-racialism. So in other words, you know, when we see programs working with students of color to appear multicultural, particularly putting students of color on a particular pedestal to keep up appearances, what does that mean, right? Because it's one thing to honor our students of color, but we have to ask questions when we see our programs putting like maybe just one student of color or one of each student of color or a certain limited number of students of color in, you know, important positions. And then we have to acknowledge and ask, how often are they being heard in those particular positions that they're put in, right? So when we have students of color who are graduate assistants, right? How often are we actually utilizing their gifts and experiences rather than using them for main appearance, right? And not really engaging with them and their experiences as racialized beings. We also have to acknowledge inappropriate gatekeeping practices that screen for people of color who are outspoken about their racial experiences, because that is a thing that has been happening in counselor education. The inappropriate gatekeeping practices could be as simple as attitudes that say, this student is too loud and outspoken, they're not appropriate for the field. We have to ask ourselves why we think that way. What makes them unprofessional in our eyes when we encounter that situation, right? We have to acknowledge and think about what is it about gatekeeping that can be harmful, and how do we rectify that? How do we practice good, ethical, and socially responsive, culturally responsive gatekeeping practices so that when students of color are vocal about their experiences, or when minoritized counselor educators counseling students are vocal, we're honoring what they have to say. And we're honoring the emotion in what they have to say, because there is passion in that. And so we have to acknowledge the gifts of our minoritized students and counselor education faculty, and not pin it on them as a sign of weakness, as a sign of unprofessionalism, or anything of that sort. We also have to acknowledge how, as something that could impact student welfare, when programs engage in color evasive practices. Notice I didn't say colorblind, right? Because that's what we might know that as, but we want to change that language because that's not appropriate for blind folks, okay? And so when we think about evading conversations about color, right? Through denying racism in incidents with students and faculty of color, ignoring systems that perpetuate racism, right? We have to really think about what do these evasive practices look like and call them out when we see it. And ask ourselves, why is it that our faculty are avoiding conversations about this? Or how come students are avoiding conversations about this? How do we encourage people to be color brave, right? That has been a buzzword that has been circulating around in the counseling discourse lately. So how do we encourage more people to be color brave and talk about the taboo, what's hard to talk about? So we also have to really, in order to really recognize and understand how white supremacy can still exist in counselor education, we have to look at the different ways that it's internalized in student and faculty culture, right? We have to look at ourselves and think, what are the things that we hold on to that are rooted in white supremacy and social dominance? So for example, Jones and Okun, even though this work goes way back in early 2000s, it is still so relevant today. And when I saw this research, I was sitting there going, yes, we see this time and time again when folks are experiencing struggles with their white identities or their internalized whiteness in general, which is the idea of we're internalizing certain traditions or cultural norms about white supremacy. So for example, perfectionism. That's actually a form of white supremacy. Why? Because we have to acknowledge that when we hold ourselves to these perfectionistic standards, we have to think beyond that and go, who are we doing that for? Like students of color may experience perfectionism, for example, because they're trying so hard to navigate primarily white environments to appear professional or to appear scholarly for their teachers, right? So we have to acknowledge that. And also too, white students are also haunted by perfectionism, especially when it comes to multicultural issues. We hear a lot of the times how white students may say, I'm scared to talk about multicultural things because I'm scared of messing up. I'm scared of looking racist. So they won't say anything, but they're still harboring ideas that need to be worked through and deconstructed. So how do we deconstruct the idea of perfectionism and really create a space where students and faculty can have color brave conversations and take risks in order to engage in racial healing? What about either or thinking, right? Rigid thinking that does not leave room for any type of critical consciousness. That's just the way it is type of thinking, right? We have to challenge those types of thoughts when they show up in counselor education, and especially when it comes to navigating educational institutions. We have to let some of that thinking go and instead shift towards ideas of, you know, not just this is the way it is, but thinking about how can things be? What are the different ways that things could be that we haven't tried before when it comes to challenging things that are oppressive in counselor education culture? Too much focus on objectivity, right? We see this a lot and in very subtle ways when it comes to the focus on quantitative research. There is this myth that quantitative research is purely objective, which is false. And there's research to suggest that, right? That's a hot take right there, what I just said, and I know that. But qualitative research teaches us that there are other ways to look at research too, and that does not vilify quantitative research. What it says is that quantitative research isn't perfect either, and that mixture of really teaching quant and qual traditions can help us really challenge what is objectivity. Do we all really have it? How do we ensure as much of it as possible in ways that are realistic? And also the right to comfort. This is one that's really been showing up a lot in various social discourses. A lot of people will say, if I'm not explicitly racist, then I am not racist. And that's not true. People can still be implicitly racist, even without realizing it as such. And that is such a scary thought for people. That is scary to think that any one of us, even myself, could practice racism at some point in our lives towards somebody else in a very subtle way that we don't recognize it, right? We hear this all the time when, for example, when Black folks experience racism from people who will walk past a person of color, a Black person on the sidewalk, and clutch their bag, right? They don't know why they're doing that, but it's implicitly racist. And it's important that we acknowledge, lean into the discomfort, as Dr. Chris Linder would say, lean into the discomfort and really think about, right, that all of us could be implicitly racist and we have to do something about that. That doesn't mean that we're necessarily bad people. It does mean that we have to do something about it. We have to acknowledge it when it shows up. rather than pretend that we can't be racist. And so I want us to really take a look at some forms of externalized white supremacy in student and faculty culture, right? So we want to take a look at worship of the written word. This was a really powerful term that I saw that I said, oh yeah, this is something huge, right? Where people with strong written skills are valued over others due to literacy-based stigmas. Yes, we want to know that our students could write academically. We do want that, we know that. However, is that the only thing that matters, right? What forms of research are we teaching where written skills are the only ones that are valued? What about artistic forms of research, right? How often do we prioritize that? Because that's got to have some value and some merit in ways that qualitative research measures very well. So we have to think about that. We have to think about when we look at students who can write really well, are we prioritizing them over students who can't? Are we treating them as they are more credible? Are we not honoring the gifts of students who aren't natural writers? What other gifts do they possibly have? Because maybe they're strong speakers. Maybe that's their thing. So that's something we need to acknowledge, and that's something we need to foster and look at. Power hoarding, y'all. This is huge, especially in group projects and collaborative research, right? A lot of times in our social discourses, we write these people off as just toxic, but that's not it. There's elements of white supremacy here where if I want to receive credit, if I want to be first author, I have to have the power. If I'm going to be the first person to respond to every group email, that's me accumulating social power, because it's letting that respondent know that I'm the one in charge. I'm the one who's always on top of things, right? So we have to acknowledge that, especially when racial dynamics are involved in group work or collaborative research. Defensiveness and fear of open conflict. Ouch. This is one that a lot of people can really struggle with, because again, it's hard for people to admit when we are, practicing racism, even implicitly. It's a scary thing to think about, but we have to be color brave together and think about how do we move through these things rather than avoid them. Last but not least, individualism is very correlated to power hoarding. So there's this high value that's placed on those who get things done on their own, which means whose voices are being left out of projects. We see this a lot in research curricula too. We see a lot of social discourses out there and a lot of colleagues out there who feel as if they need to do research on their own and they need to be the only author because that gives them the most acclaim. But when they're doing that with research that involves minoritized groups and they have social identities, whose voices are being left out of that work with minoritized communities? And that's something that we got to pay attention to. We need to include authors of color. We need to include minoritized voices as co-authors to be able to show that we are accounting for all points of view and that all voices are being expressed. And it's not one researcher speaking for and therefore othering minoritized communities in counselor education work. So we need to also look at the impacts of white supremacy on students of color. So the research has gone on to support this. And I've seen it firsthand and secondhand, that students of color do feel dismissed and questioned by white colleagues in the classroom, which can cause them to withdraw from participation in classroom environments. So we have to acknowledge that when that's happening in our classrooms and think, what are we gonna do about that as counselor educators, right? How do we challenge these racial dynamics, these racial power dynamics that are going on in my own classroom? Students of color reported feeling used when working with faculty members who are exploiting them because students of color felt exploited to maintain this illusion of post-racialism. So that has happened before too. So in this article, for example, one of the participants really talked about how they felt honored when a faculty member invited them to present with them at a conference. But when they co-presented with them at a conference, the conversation was so inequitable and absent to the point where they felt like they were just a showpiece, really, as the faculty member really just presented a lot of the material and really presented the material in a way where it's like that student didn't really have any involvement in anything. Again, it's this idea of tokenism. Students of color also reported feeling isolated, gaslit, and internalized racism due to experiences of minority stress in counselor education, especially when navigating and interacting with white faculty and colleagues. So we have to acknowledge what are the types of behaviors that we are seeing in counselor education that impact students of color in harmful ways, and how do we address that so we can move forward again in racial healing. So we have to also look at and acknowledge that white supremacy can also harmfully impact white students, okay? And here's some of the reasons why. So white supremacy causes white people to dismiss their white identities as racial altogether. And so that's very dangerous when we are trying to train white counselor educators and students to work with minoritized students and clients and supervisees, because then they're dismissing racial experiences as a whole, and that can be very harmful towards minoritized communities. There's also this idea that white supremacy impacts white students by producing cognitive processes, ideas, schemas that lead to white fragility. So the idea of defensiveness, that my ego is shattered when somebody calls me a racist because I can't believe somebody would think I'm such a bad person, right? Because in reality, what is happening is that a lot of folks of color are trying to challenge and nudge their white colleagues to be like, hey, listen, the way that you move about this program, the way that you interact with colleagues or with students, there's really this internalized dominance that's there through the little things that you do. And we're trying to be able to find a way to call white students to pay attention to that. But white students can't see that a lot of times because of the impacts of white supremacy. So white supremacy, in effect, also harms white students from gaining that insight. Furthermore, too, white folks will receive early conditioning early on, and that's not for everybody, but it is something that is prevalent in cultural discourse that promotes the following behaviors, right? Disconnection from communities of color, admiration of white supremacy in explicit and implicit ways, living on land without understanding who the land was stolen from, denial of America's racist history, promoting thinking over feeling, promoting values of dominance and greed, promoting ideas that people of color are always interested in vengeance, distorting lived experiences of communities of color, and scarcity mentalities that promote and justify global violence, right? So it's this idea that for the scarcity idea, it's this idea of, oh, well, all the opportunities are being taken away from me. They're all being given to the people of color. When there is enough experiences, there is enough opportunities to go around for plenty of socially dominant folks. So we have to challenge those myths because they start in early conditioning. And that's something that we need to address and explore when it shows up in counselor education. So we also have to really take a look at the impacts of white supremacy on actual faculty members. So white faculty members may present as arrogant, dismissive, and resistant to change if they are not aware of how white supremacy influences their interactions. So they might definitely experience this defensiveness when a student of color is telling them, hey, listen, some of the things that you're doing is really hurtful to students of color. Some of the things that you're either talking about or some of the ways that you're treating students of color in the classroom, this is harmful. And white supremacy can oftentimes create this defensiveness among white faculty members to the point where, again, they're blocked from a deeper level of insight about how they show up in racial spaces. White supremacy can also influence who counselor educators admit into counselor education programs, especially regarding racially salient applicants. So what the research means by that is that when people are writing cover letters as to get admitted into counselor education programs, and their racial identities, their racial experiences as minoritized folks, that's really the main focus of what they do because they want to promote racial justice and change. The attitudes of white supremacy can totally influence who counselor educators take seriously and who they don't. Because if people are seen as racially charged, there might be a negative stigma that white supremacy produces about those students, that they're too outspoken, that they are not willing to learn new things. I've heard as well as discourse that, oh, well, some students of color need to know how to learn how to take both sides. And that's very dangerous thinking that is brought on by white supremacy. Last but not least, white supremacy impacts faculty members by promoting a lack of appreciation, respect, and value for Black colleagues in faculty work, as well as for just colleagues of color in general. This is also true in the way that theory and research shows up in research projects too. So if a colleague wants to work on something, or if a student of color wants to work on something, white supremacy could try to discredit certain theories or ideas because they don't have enough quote unquote empirical evidence, like critical race theory, right? That's one that's being highly contested in education right now, simply because it is full of racially charged ideas of unpacking racial history and herstory in ways that actually affirm communities of color. So we have to really acknowledge how white supremacy impacts faculty members too in harmful ways. So white supremacy also in counselor education is going to seep into and impact the clients that these students see as well. So it promotes cultural mistrust. It promotes, again, color evasive attitudes, and it also promotes dominant stigma images, right? Which can be projected onto minoritized clients when students in counselor education are not encouraged to challenge how white supremacy shapes their thinking. So these are things that we have to acknowledge that still show up in counselor education, because they're going to impact the clients that these students see in our programs, therefore perpetuating racism out into the world outside of counselor education. So let's talk about how do we work through this, right? What are some of the strategies? What do we do about this? So I wanted to talk to y'all about ways that we can build knowledge, skills, action plans, and advocacy strategies, right? Thank you to the MSJCC, right? The Multicultural Social Justice Competencies, right? We want to take a look at, that's what I modeled this after, and I wanted to really apply some strategies and ideas to each of the 4 domains as part of our ongoing lifelong learning as culturally responsive counselor educators. So first, we need to start analyzing counselor education curriculum through a critical lens, right? So how do we acknowledge that counselor education curriculum may still have a white-centered gaze or a socially dominant gaze, right? Where all the theories we're teaching, they are based on the same cultural sources and foundations. How do we change that? How do we change that so that our counselor education curriculums implement different voices, different histories, right? All of that. Also too, this leads into really teaching counselor education theories and approaches that speak directly to minoritized communities. So we have to really think about what are the theories that really speak to racialized experiences or minoritized experiences, because some of the main foundational theories that we spend a lot of time teaching don't actually do that. They don't acknowledge the impacts of systemic violence, and that's dangerous. Lastly, dedication to program-wide education on white supremacy and its impact on counselor education, which is what y'all are doing right now. This is part of the work that y'all are doing. You are right now engaging in knowledge building. So I'm so glad that so many people are here today to really give this a chance and really think about what if there are different ways that we can go about counselor education. How can we transform this field into one that's more inclusive? So I'm so happy to know that a lot of people are here today. Thank you all again for being here. So let's look at strategies and awareness building. So how often are we engaging faculty and students to participate in focus groups that talk about white supremacy and deconstruct it? That would be a really useful strategy and idea to use. For those of you who are already doing that, awesome. And this is all for the people who haven't thought of this yet. I encourage y'all to really think about what that means, because it could be really helpful to deconstruct the ideas that many of us grew up with and internalized that are shaped by cultural oppression. Also, we need to be providing trainings and discussions on white defensiveness and white fragility and color evasive behaviors. We need to know what those things look like. And the articles that are cited here are excellent resources to really go through with y'all what these things mean, because they all tie to the central idea of being avoidant about conversations related to cultural oppression, experiencing defensiveness when we are exhibiting a harmful behavior. And instead of acknowledging the behavior, we go into this ultimate shutdown mode. And instead, we might victim blame the person who was trying to call in that behavior. So these resources are really cool, and I encourage folks to check them out because they are so useful. And they have been so helpful to many of our counselor educators today who are openly practicing anti-racism. It is not enough to not just be to not be racist. We have to go beyond not being racist and be anti-racist. Lastly, too, we have to provide more opportunities for self-reflexivity throughout counselor education. I think Dr. Chris Linder really inspired me in that too, as she really taught students in my cohort what it meant to reflect on our cultural identities and how they show up in various spaces. So thank you to Dr. Chris Linder for doing that. And I really appreciate that. These are things that all of us should be doing to promote awareness building so we could deconstruct white supremacy. Strategies and skill building. So we need to be teaching culturally responsive interventions in counseling, teaching, research, and supervision. All of it, okay? Especially when they disrupt white supremacy. For example, what are we implementing about storytelling approaches, right? In culturally humility-based ways. Community empowerment approaches, right? How are we involving the community in work? So for example, participatory action research does a great job of this in research. So how often are we really teaching that in our research courses? We have to think about the same idea of what are we doing about this in supervision? What type of skills are we teaching our supervisees so they can acknowledge and affirm the voices and lived experiences of communities of color and other minoritized communities? Replacing pedagogy with andragogy. Now, this is huge. One of my earlier textbooks in teaching me about teaching really talked about the difference between pedagogy and andragogy. So pedagogy is basically this idea of we are teaching somebody else, like we are teaching down to them. And andragogy is really treating everybody as equals in the classroom and really inviting a space where we all learn together. So how do we make that shift happen to be more culturally responsive in counselor education and to invite diverse ideas and perspectives? We also need to teach more strategies and approaches that help promote accountability practices like privilege journals. Thank you again, Dr. Chris Linder, for that, because that was a huge thing that really impacted my racial growth and thinking, oh, wow, I didn't think about that, right? Privilege journals allow us to question and really wrestle with some of the things, the cultural dynamics that show up in our lives, as well as promoting community circles, social justice-based trainings to promote overall skill growth and just dedication to learn more. Are we gonna always know all of the skills to be culturally responsive? And are we gonna know all of the skills to deconstruct white supremacy? No, but the dedication can help us get there. Next, I want us to talk about strategies in advocacy development. So we need to really move away from the paralysis of analysis that I mentioned earlier in the presentation and really think about what are the advocacy skills that we can use in counselor education. So how are we teaching our counselors and our supervisees to advocate alongside their clients? How are we also showing up for students in their practicum sites and their internship sites? These are things we need to think about. Are we providing opportunities for students to practice advocacy skills? Even with programmatic issues, are we inviting that, or are we trying to shut students down? Lastly, we also need to look at providing opportunities for community engagement with social justice leaders. Who are we inviting to our campuses to talk to our classes, right? A lot of times, our professors might be just trying to teach multicultural education, but we're not inviting actual community leaders to help us teach it, because their perspectives and the way they teach could truly be enlightening and could really get us out of the socially dominant gaze of things and the socially dominant perspectives of things. So we need to think about that. We can't ultimately engage in healing with the community if we're not learning from the community. So it's just food for thought. So now I want to open this up to y'all too. So I want to hear from some people with the rest of the time that we have left, right? what are some stories that you're willing to share about how you see white supremacy still exist in counselor education? Or I want to hear from folks about how does white supremacy impact you and your students? And lastly, I want to hear from folks, how can we start to take action and disrupt white supremacy in counselor education? So now this is the time where, oh, I'm gonna look at the chat because I know this chat's been busy. Okay, Aaron, I see you. Okay, Dr. Ford. Yes. Yeah, and I want to hear from folks too, please feel free to, unmute, and of course be respectful and, take turns and all that, just to share and openly reflect on some of these things that we're really reflecting on today.
Frank, first of all, really good job, but I'm not even shocked you did a good job. I knew you would.
Oh, Dr. Ford, thank you. By the way, I think I saw you at a previous presentation and I was like, I want to know this person. So now it's the fates connecting us.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I think the first thing, I had one of my mentees who's a doctor and who's always going to be in this job search asking me, how do you show up authentically and still, show these people that you want to get a job and want to get hired? And I said, right. And I said, the first thing is, do not let this profession take you out of yourself.
Woo! That's a sermon.
And then not everyone has the right to your authentic self. Not everyone deserves your authentic self. And so you have to show up and know that your presence as a Black man, as a queer Black man, is going to disrupt white supremacy anyway.
Woo!
Your presence is going to be a way of protesting white supremacy. So if your presence is going to be a disruption to white supremacy, use your voice to even disrupt it even more. I say my job is to shake shit up.
Yes.
And you have to show up and then challenge your white colleagues not to be that white ally that supports you in silence. Be that white accomplice that supports you in the meeting. And so, if they come to you after the meeting and say, I believe everything you said, you say, wait a minute, hold up, that doesn't do anything right now. You should have said something when it could have meant something when you in the meeting when I said it. So we have to be the ones to challenge folks to say, hey, this is how you really show up for people of color. This is how you really show up and challenge your own white supremacy and your own privilege. This is how you really show up and live your privilege to support those of us that don't have the same voice that you do. This is when you show up and you shut up and let us talk.
Preach. Yes. I love that. I knew we were destined to meet, so I know we're going to connect later. I know it. Thank you for sharing. Who else would like to share their thoughts and their reflections on what we're talking about? Oh yeah, okay, so yeah, I'm totally willing to share the PowerPoint and citations, absolutely. However we want to do that, whatever the easiest way is, I'm totally down for that.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Yes. I just saw that too as I'm like looking at the chat. Who else would like to share their thoughts and their reflections of what we're talking about with the time we have left?
I think for me, Dr. Ford's comments about the student wondering how he gets a job and is still able to be his authentic self really illustrates one of the largest hurdles for myself in addressing white supremacy in counselor education. In my role as a counselor educator is that I often struggle with this idea that one day I'm going to say something and it's going to make me lose my job and I'm not trying to mess up my money. So, right? So there's that reality where how do we speak to issues and still honestly like watch out for our own personal welfare? And I think that's something that's often left out of these conversations.
Let me guess, you're pre-tenured, aren't you?
I'm in a non-tenured position, but yes.
Oh, okay, that's when you find someone who is willing to be that go-between for you. Like, okay, I'm pre-tenured. Hopefully by March 15th, I'll find out whether I'm tenured or not. But as someone who's pre-tenured, I still speak up and speak out. But and I know that there are those that are around me that are in non-tenure lines, or and rightly so, have this idea or are afraid to speak up, and I understand that. So you might want to find that person that can be in your corner that has that privilege, will live their privilege in a way that'll support you and also challenge those structures.
And y'all, please be that person in somebody's corner. Like, there's power in numbers. There really is. So please be in somebody's corner.
Look, I don't mind falling on the sword, because I'll pull it out and use that sword as my weapon.
You better know. That's what we do. Yes.
You know, and I think, again, this analogy of falling on your sword is very real. I have had white allies that I've had side conversations with bring issues up to the larger group. And I have had those same white allies, or I've watched them be punished, right, for bringing these issues up. And so again, for me as a minority or a racialized minority, like, it really reinforces this idea that you can really challenge to a certain extent before some type of punishment is going to be exacted. And it's not, you know, like, to some extent, I'm willing to accept punishment to some extent, or consequences to some extent, but then there's also my livelihood at stake. So how can we create systems that create safe, confidential spaces for people to voice concerns, so that it's not always like the sacrificial lamb who says something gets booted out, but then change is enacted after that person is gone.
And that's why I love the idea of like whole cohorts speaking up together, like cohorts really unifying, because it's like at that point too, it becomes more difficult to get rid of your entire cohort and then be asked questions why, right? Or like having your whole faculty on board, which isn't easy, but it's something that through securing allyship and through being there for one another, that teamwork is really impactful, even in just small ways. And I live to see it. So like, I hope that all of y'all are teammates that I can call on across the country. I'm gonna remember all your names. I'm gonna find and be like, okay, let me see. Let me go find this person. And be like, how's it going? Yes. You may not remember me, but I remember you because you attended my presentation. I hope that we could all be allies to each other.
Is your name Janae or Janae? I don't want to misspeak.
It's Janae.
Hi, Janae. So I put something in the chat for you. And so it's important for you to, or I encourage you to rely on your connections, right? And so making sure you foster and maintain those relationships. I have people at my university, my very, very white university, who call themselves allies or co-conspirators or accomplices and all those, names that we run down the list. And so I challenge them to be just that. And when I teach allyship, when I teach those things, I tell them, I said, listen, you can't call yourself an ally or any of those others names if you aren't willing to lose something. And so it means that you're willing to lose something. So if they are getting consequences, that means that they are really walking in the name that they are walking in. I also encourage you not to compromise your identity. I found myself really, I don't want to say assimilating, but playing into the system for that, for livelihood purposes, for promotion purposes, for all of those things. And I realized that what I was losing was even greater than what I would have lost if I just would have spoke up. And so sometimes we have to prioritize our mental health. We have to prioritize our identity. We have to prioritize those things that may not be as physically tangible for the sake of our souls. And then finally, I encourage you to engage in collective, I call it collective self-care, because for me, self-care doesn't happen in a silo. For me, it happens within community, where you have a space where you're going to that helps to refuel you and refuel you, my Trenton coming out, replenish you, and pour into you, right? Because at the end of the day, to your point, Janae, there is going to be a loss there. And so that means you need a space to grieve and then to armor back up so that you can continue moving forward.
Ooh, thank you.
That is a sermon, Dr. White. You and I need to connect later too. I want to learn how I can be just like you. I'm working towards that.
And Dr. White, you were just like, you were preaching. And one thing that I had to do is get out of situations where they were toxic for me, that were spaces that did not want me. That's when I came to the realization that not everyone deserves access to my authentic self. They don't want it. They want a facsimile of you. They want somebody black, but not somebody black. They want somebody queer, but not somebody queer. So I had to go where like the full me was not only tolerated, but celebrated.
Preach. That is why I'm going to be wearing my heart-shaped sunglasses to faculty interviews so they know. And if it's rainy, right, I've got my rainbow light up umbrella so people know this is the space I'm showing up to. Yes. Who else would like to share their thoughts? This is really good conversation. I appreciate everybody that's just willing to be here, be present, and to speak out.
Fantastic job, Frank.
Erin!
I love to listen to you. So I'm taking Dr. Love's class right now, hip hop pedagogy, and she had us read Dr. Mark Lamont Hill book about nobody. And one of the couple of the chapters I read, the word that kept coming up was like efficiency, and like how much of our country and political system is geared toward that. And I feel like that is so much part of academia is efficiency. Like people don't care if you have mental health challenges or you develop physical illnesses because of your workload. They just want your workload. They don't really care about your soul. And so I just feel like part of the whole toxic mess of all of this is kind of that fast-paced efficiency, like you have to produce mentality that it's really hard to get out of, in addition. Exactly. Yeah. Sean wrote, the institution does not love you. Yeah. I mean, I work at a big institution, not academia yet, but it's just very apparent, it's just very, you feel just kind of like a number. So I think like Dr. White was saying, just finding those community spaces, affirming spaces. Dr. Ford was saying like where people will, respect and value you. So, but I appreciate all this. It's a lot to think about, but great job.
And, thank you. And, like, I'm so excited though, too, because I want to acknowledge that right now we are at a historical point of time and space where right now, this is what we are experiencing. But I want to help create institutions where we do love our students. We do love our faculty. We honor and respect them. Like this is the space that's helped building that into existence, right? I'm clearly getting new agey a little bit here because I'm a little new agey, but it's just this idea of, I want to see it. I live to see it. And I hope that through this conversation, somehow we're putting out that seed to really get that started. Because I really thought about what you said, Sean, about the idea of the institution doesn't love you. And the one thing I thought of was like, I can't wait to help create an institution that does love you. because we need something different.